Imagine standing on a windswept volcanic island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, surrounded by nearly 1,000 massive stone figures that have watched over this place in silence for centuries. For generations, historians have seen a story of self-destruction here, but the soil beneath these silent giants holds a much more surprising reality. The story we've been told. For most of the 20th century, Easter Island was held up as one of history's most dramatic cautionary tales, a place where an entire civilization dug its own grave out of obsession and ecological blindness. The story, as told in textbooks and documentaries, went like this. The Rapa Nui people arrived on this isolated volcanic island around 1200 AD, built a thriving society, and then slowly destroyed it by cutting down every last tree in sight, all to carve and transport their giant stone statues. Without trees, the soil eroded, crops failed, freshwater sources dried up, and the population eventually descended into warfare, starvation, and, in some tellings, even cannibalism. In 2005, Jared Diamond's bestseller, Collapse, took this narrative global, making Easter Island the ultimate case study for what happens when a society refuses to live within its ecological limits. The image resonated precisely because it acted as a mirror, a small island consuming its resources and paying the ultimate price, a warning to our modern world on the same trajectory at a much larger scale. When this version of the story took hold, Easter Island stopped being a place and became a parable. The trouble with a good parable, however, is that it tends to resist correction, even when the evidence demands it. Beginning in the early 2000s, archaeologists began to look more closely at what was actually buried beneath the island's surface, and what they found didn't fit the standard narrative at all. The collapse narrative, it turned out, had been built on assumptions, misinterpretations, and a striking willingness to see a disaster where the data told a much more complex story. What the excavations revealed. When the Easter Island Statue Project began systematic excavations around the base of the Moai in the early 2000s, the first discovery alone was enough to redefine everything. For centuries, visitors to the island had looked at what appeared to be just massive, disembodied heads, but when archaeologists excavated around their base, they found these faces were only the visible part of something much larger. Below the surface, each statue had a torso, arms pressed to its sides, fingers on the belly, back etched with petroglyphs, loincloths, tattoos, preserved for centuries. At the Rano Raraku quarry, some of the figures, once fully excavated, stood over 9 meters tall, revealing a level of artistic refinement that the half-buried versions had completely hidden. Under Platform A, ground-penetrating radar and controlled digs revealed an even stranger find. Sealed tomb chambers built into the foundations. Inside lay chiefs, priests, and master artisans, with razor-precise obsidian tools. Proof of years of expert training, not a culture in decline. Signaling peak mastery. Chemical analysis of shell fragments found in these chambers revealed they came from Polynesian islands hundreds, even thousands, of kilometers away, proving that the Rapa Nui maintained active long-distance trade networks across the Pacific for far longer than anyone had previously believed. Hidden pigment pits near Rano Raraku, filled with carefully processed red ochre and sealed for preservation, confirmed that an elaborate ceremonial life continued well into the 1700s, long after this organized society was supposed to have completely collapsed. The living statues. Of all the discoveries made on Easter Island in recent decades, the one made in 1978 by Rapa Nui archaeologist Sonia Hawa holds perhaps the most striking human detail. Excavating around a toppled statue, Hawa uncovered fragments of white coral and polished red scoria that, when pieced together, revealed an instantly recognizable shape, a pair of large eyes, carefully carved to fit into the deep oval sockets cut into every Moai face. Until then, the world had seen these giants as blank, expressionless faces, but this discovery revealed they were never meant to look that way. Once their coral eyes were in place, the Moai weren't just representations of ancestors. According to Rapa Nui belief, they were those ancestors themselves, present and watchful, their gaze carrying the full spiritual authority of the dead over the living community gathered at their feet. This same depth of civilization extended to the island's written language. Easter Island developed Rongorongo, the only indigenous writing system created anywhere in the Pacific before European contact, made up of hundreds of distinct glyphs carved on wooden tablets dealing with lunar calendars, genealogy, ritual grounds, and perhaps navigation data for open ocean voyaging. Writing systems don't emerge in simple or feeling societies. They require literate specialists, formal education, and a body of knowledge complex enough to be worth preserving permanently. The existence of Rongorongo, still largely undeciphered after 150 years of scholarly effort, is quiet but powerful evidence that this civilization was operating at a level of intellectual organization the collapse narrative never accounted for. Adaptation, not collapse. Around 1400 AD, a shift occurred on Easter Island, a change that traditional narratives have consistently misinterpreted as a sign of collapse. Moai construction slowed and then eventually stopped, and religious life reorganized around an entirely new institution, the Birdman competition, centered at the clifftop ceremonial village of Orongo on the island's southwestern tip. Every year, representatives from rival clans would swim through shark-infested waters to nearby islets to collect the first egg laid by migrating seabirds and bring it back to shore intact. The winning clan then held special ritual authority for the following year. Far from being a desperate lurch born of societal failure, the Birdman cult was accompanied by stone architecture of remarkable precision and an elaborate visual culture of petroglyphs, whose creation and maintenance demanded sustained organization. The ecological story, too, was far more nuanced than the standard narrative suggested. Pollen analysis showed that deforestation happened gradually over several centuries, linked not to Moai transport, but to an explosion in the population of Polynesian rats that consumed palm seeds at a rate that prevented any regeneration of the forest. The Rapa Nui didn't respond with passivity, but with ingenuity, developing lithic mulch gardens, fields covered in fragmented volcanic rock that retained moisture and protected the thin soil, preserving agricultural productivity even as forest cover declined. Imagine a Rapa Nui family in the early 1700s, carefully sealing a burial chamber beneath an ahu platform, placing Rongorongo tablets and ritual offerings beside a deceased loved one, fully expecting their grandchildren to stand in that same spot and do the exact same thing. They weren't performing the rituals of a dying civilization. They were performing the rituals of a living one, and the evidence confirms that when Europeans arrived just a few years later, this community was still functioning, still farming its land, and still very much alive. The real collapse and the DNA that proved it. It took a major advance in genetics to get the most definitive answer yet, and when it came, it didn't just challenge the collapse narrative, it dismantled it completely. In 2024, researchers published a landmark study in Nature after extracting and fully sequencing the ancient genomes of 15 Rapa Nui individuals dated between 1670 and 1950 AD, and their conclusion was unambiguous. There was no genetic evidence of a catastrophic demographic collapse before European contact, confirming what the burial chambers, pigment pits, and lithic gardens had already been quietly suggesting for years. When Europeans first set foot on Easter Island in 1722, they found exactly what the archaeology predicted: a functioning society with thousands of inhabitants, productive farmland, and active cultural practices still very much alive. What the DNA revealed next is even more remarkable. Written into the core of these ancient genomes was clear evidence of direct contact between the Rapa Nui and the indigenous peoples of South America, occurring centuries before a single European ship crossed the Pacific. These were not a people clinging to a dwindling island. They were navigators who had deliberately crossed more than 3,700 kilometers of open ocean to reach an entire continent and return, without modern instruments or outside help. The demographic collapse that eventually ravaged Easter Island came entirely from outside forces, driven by the introduction of diseases such as smallpox and tuberculosis, and by Peruvian slave raids in the 1860s that abducted more than 1,500 people in a single campaign, including the island's king and nearly its entire literate, knowledge-keeping class. By the 1870s, this civilization that had endured for more than 6 centuries was reduced to fewer than 100 survivors, destroyed not by its own failures, but by colonial devastation from across the sea. What the Moai had been telling us all along. The descendants of that small 100 or so survivors now number more than 7,000. They still live on Rapa Nui, having rebuilt their language, their cultural practices, and their ties to a history that the outside world spent decades distorting. The Moai still stand on the island, and what they represent has been silently, but definitively transformed by everything archaeology has uncovered beneath their feet. They were never monuments to an obsession, nor symbols of a civilization racing toward its own downfall. They were guardians, ancestral figures set to watch over the living, embodying the belief that the dead remain present and protective as long as the community honors them. It is striking to realize that we built an entire moralizing fable around a civilization we had fundamentally misunderstood. We watched a people capable of crossing oceans without instruments, developing the Pacific's only indigenous writing system, and adapting through centuries of real hardship, only to conclude that their story was one of failure. The Moai never warned us about what happens when ambition outstrips wisdom. They were showing us what endurance truly looks like. Easter Island was never a warning about what civilizations do to themselves when they stop paying attention. It has always been a testament to what humans can build, sustain, and pass on even in the face of extraordinary obstacles. And the stone giants watching over that island have known this truth for far longer than we have.